Hey, I want to introduce Bryan McLees. He's our guest speaker today from Convoy of Hope. When I moved here 18 years ago, I began to hang out with 3 other church planters. We were the wild and crazy church planters in this city that just loved reaching people who didn't know the Lord and loved hanging out with each other and encouraging each other. And Bryan was one of my immediate friends. Now, you're going to find as Bryan comes up here that he's like mild-mannered Clark Kent. I mean, he's just a very gentle kind of guy, but he is hilarious, first of all, and he's also just, when he opens his mouth, words of profound depth. I just think you're going to be blessed by this conversation we're going to have here. So come on up, Bryan.
Wow, you're setting the bar pretty high there. Good morning. I have really good news for you. This week, the Cameron Peak fire was 100% contained. So, yeah, 112 days, that rascal. Anyone else here in mandatory evacuation? Okay. I was really appreciative of that 12 inches of snow we got. But I got a phone call from this guy, Randy. Bryan, I see where the mandatory evacuation lines are. I've got a team of Clearwater guys that have pickup trucks, and we're helping folks that need to get evacuated. And that sounds like something simple, but you know what? It really touched something pretty deep in me. That your church was out taking care of the hood. Thank you, Randy. Turns out that's important. It's one of the things we want to look at in Scripture. The 9th chapter of Matthew is where we're going to drill down a little bit deep near the end. But how many of you have never heard of Convoy of Hope? Convoy of Hope. Never heard? Oh, wow. How many just, you'd be real honest, you've heard the name, but you don't know a lot about what Convoy does? Yeah, lots of folks. And then how many of you are veterans? Like you've participated in One Day to Feed the Sue Griffith. Thank you so much for helping me get the videos together. You hate being called out, I can tell. Thank you. I brought along a treat for us. A lot of folks don't know the origin story of Convoy of Hope. Do you know that Jesus is comfortable walking, not trivializing, but walking through doors of pain? As doors of pain are opened up for comfort and healing, care and concern. And the story of Convoy of Hope's origin really is one of those. We're going to hear from the founder, my friend, Hal Donaldson, and then briefly from the Chief Operations Officer, COO of Convoy of Hope, Craig Hood, who's going to update you a bit on some good news from this year. How many like good news this year, like more than ever? We've got some great news for you this morning. But I just wanted to cue this video up for you and then come back, and we're going to talk a little bit of a passage of Scripture that seems appropriate to a lot of things Jesus has done this year, okay? So thanks, team.
Yeah, so one of the things I've noticed anytime I've gotten to be around someone like you who really is, in the truest sense, a world changer, a revolutionary, I've noticed that their stories are never smooth sailing. They're never people who had it easy, who never had struggles, and you've certainly had your fair share. So Talk to me about how your life really began and how things started to change for you.
Yeah, at the age of 12, my parents were hit by a drunken driver, and my father was killed instantly. My mother was seriously injured, would be in the hospital for a number of months, and that was a very traumatic experience in our lives. But I'll never forget the night that the police came to tell us what had happened. They knocked on the door. I went to the door, and there were 2 uniformed police officers standing there, and they told me that my father was dead. My mom was fighting for her life. And a number of neighbors gathered in the front yard, and a police officer stepped up to the porch and he addressed the crowd. He said, "Are there any family members or friends who are here tonight who are willing to take the 4 children home with them? If not, we'll take the children downtown to the station." And that night, one young couple raised their hands and they said, "We'll take them." Now, Sam, I'm sure they thought it was going to be 1 or 2 nights, but we ended up living with Bill and Levada Davis for a year. And all they had was a small trailer. That small trailer is where we lived, and that was a place where we experienced the shame of poverty, but also the power of kindness, because the Davis family, they just wrapped their arms around us and they showed us that they loved us and that we had a future.
From the perspective of a mom, thinking about my young kids, and anytime you hear a story like that, I think it's human nature to kind of put yourself in that situation. I just can't imagine, as a mom, how you handle that. The loss of your husband and your partner, and then her own difficulties that she was dealing with physically, and then knowing the trauma that your children are going through. How did your mom manage all that?
She was a fighter. Sorry.
No, don't
She was
apologize.
A fighter. She was determined that she was not going to be a welfare mom forever. My dad didn't have insurance. The man who hit them didn't have insurance. And so, the family all of a sudden was thrust into a life of welfare and living on food stamps. And so there were some very difficult days the cupboards were empty, and, days that we had to go to school without a sack lunch, and we didn't have the nicest clothes. But my mom, she was determined. In front of us 4 kids, she was a portrait of strength and courage. But in her bedroom at night, sometimes, Sam, I would hunker down outside her door and I'd listen to her cry herself to sleep, As a 12 or 13-year-old boy, I remember asking God, seriously, I just say, "God, you got to bring something good out of this. Can you help my mom?" Some very discouraging days, but I have to tell you that's probably why I am so passionate about our Women's Empowerment Program, because it really is giving women hope, and it's giving them opportunity.
Yeah. When I hear you say that, the first thing that comes to my mind is that in those type of traumatic or difficult situations, maybe we don't even know it at the time because, like you said, you were 12. But you kind of have a choice to make about the trajectory of your life. And I don't blame anyone who then chooses to essentially become a victim and feel sorry for themselves, because there's good reason for that. You very easily could have done that, and you could have been really bitter for the rest of your life. And it could have just been a sad story, but that is not your story. And that's the reason we're all here today. How did you take that and turn it into this?
The power of kindness. I experienced it firsthand. I tell the story about one woman who saw that I had holes in my shoes, and she asked my mom if she could take me to a shoe store. And, there was shoes that were, at that time, Kinney shoes. They had pairs for $2.99, $3.99, and $4.99. And naturally, all I'd ever worn was the $2.99 pair. And I walked into that shoe store with that woman and who attended our church, and I made a beeline to the $2.99 pair, and she said, no, today it's the $4.99 pair. You're going to get the best that they have. And, so I think with me, my brothers, my sister, we saw the power of kindness firsthand. We experienced that people wrapped their arms around us. My mom didn't even have a college education. She had a high school degree, and yet she was so determined. She got a part-time job as a mail clerk, and she worked her way up into a full-time job, And so, why did we survive all of that? I think a lot of it was the power of kindness from others, but also a mother who just said, "I'm not going to let you feel sorry for yourself."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of people, though, would, once they start having some success, and Dick talked about that in your story, and obviously you had talents and ability that once you got through college, were going to take you to what I think we consider in a lot of ways the American dream, just have enough stuff and live safe and comfortably and kind of do this, right?
Yeah.
But you haven't done that. You've done a whole lot of this. So what was kind of the impetus of that, and how did that become Convoy of Hope?
There were several other things that happened post-college that I think were incredibly formational in my life. And one was when I took a book project that took me to Calcutta, India, and I had the opportunity to meet Mother Teresa. And Mother Teresa, she asked me what I was doing to help the poor and the suffering. And she told me that day, she said, everyone can do something. Well, those words were haunting for me. They really were. And I came back to the States, and I was writing books at the time, and so I thought, well, what would be really a cool idea is to travel to 8 cities across America and to live in the streets for 3 days and 3 nights. I went to Miami, Atlanta, Chicago, DC, New York, and I lived in the streets, and I interviewed drug addicts and gang members, prostitutes, runaways, those who were homeless, and that really changed me. And it was on the heels of that adventure, if you will, that we loaded up our first pickup truck 26 years ago with $300 worth of groceries and went into a needy area and started passing out groceries to hurting people. Mm-hmm. And that was the start of Convoy of Hope.
Can I go back to something really quick? Because it made me nervous, even just hearing you tell the story of the question. When Mother Teresa looks at you and asks you, what are you doing to help the poor? What did you say?
Well, some of you have heard me say this before. I figured I better not lie to her.
Right? Yeah, that wouldn't go well.
Yeah, you better tell her the truth. And I just said, I'm really not doing much of anything. Now, you have to understand the context of that. When you grow up poor, your quest in life becomes not to become poor anymore. And, in my 20s, early 30s, that was my quest. I just didn't want to be poor.
Revolutionaries lead with kindness. And I think sometimes we get in our minds that in order to be a revolutionary, like you have to have a sword or be angry you can be, there is some righteous anger involved. But what you've done and what Convoy of Hope is continuing to do is to lead with kindness. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for letting me do this. This has been great.
Thank you, Hal, for sharing the story of your family and the story of your heart. I'm Craig Hood, and I'm the Chief Operations Officer at Convoy of Hope. This year, we've seen the Lord's favor at every turn. Despite the worldwide pandemic, we've seen more and more people partnering with Convoy of Hope. This is how we're able to help feed and empower the vulnerable people in communities around the world. Now for something really exciting. There's an organization called Charity Navigator. It rates all of the charities operating in the U.S., and we just found out for the 17th consecutive year, Convoy of Hope has received their highest rating, their 4-star rating. This is something only 1% of the charities operating in the United States can claim. This level of efficiency and ethical practice is what has also caused corporate America to give to Convoy of Hope, and that allows every dollar to be multiplied. And your generosity makes an even greater impact on children's feeding initiatives, women's empowerment, agriculture, community events, disaster response, and rural initiatives. And now to share a little bit more about how Convoy of Hope has pivoted to meet the needs that the world is facing, let's hear what Bryan McLeese has to say. Bryan's been with Convoy of Hope for 15 years, and he's also an active member of the Vineyard community of churches. He's been planting Vineyard churches since 1982 and really understands the missional heart of Vineyard leadership and churches. Over to you, Bryan.
Good morning. How many of you recognized Sam Ponder from ESPN? Okay. Sports fans? We got sports fans, this group? Yeah. Her husband, by the way, is one of the quarterbacks for the Minnesota Vikings and strong lovers of Jesus and advocates for Convoy of Hope. And just so you know, that was filmed around March 6th, before the crazy really got crazy. And, I want to reference some things about Hal's childhood in a moment. And the text this morning is actually the story of Jesus, familiar to most of us, feeding a great crowd of people in Mark chapter 6, 34. And It's also in Matthew, the end of the chapter 9. But you can see it in John 6. And, how many know when the Gospels repeat something 4 times, we're supposed to really clue in? And that's where we're going in a moment. But I just want to piggyback on what Craig mentioned, that we had to pivot this year, didn't we? And we usually do community events. We've done one in Fort Collins years ago. But that just simply wasn't going to be safe to have 10,000 people on a site mingling. And so what the Lord spoke to us was to resource local churches to care for the newly furloughed and those who are working poor and those who may be in foreclosure. Because I'll tell you what, when Pastor Randy calls and says, we got a group of folks with pickup trucks and we want to help, it really does, doesn't it? It touches something deep. And we thought, let's set a goal of, by the end of April, this is back in March, right when this was happening, and let's resource churches to serve 10 million meals, which really, truly was, based on what we saw in our warehouse, a lofty goal. But we really, before then, went past 10 million meals to 20 million. And many times throughout these last several months have seen the warehouse go way down in terms of the product. But the corporate sponsorship that Craig referenced is now over 400 companies. Companies like Bass Pro, Home Depot, Culligan International, Georgia Pacific. We actually got to give away toilet paper to churches to give to people. And they couldn't get it on the grocery shelves, but they could get it at a church. And that touches people deeply. Open up the opportunity to say, hey, can I pray for you for anything you're going through right now? So that as of this past year, watching, my confidence in the Lord has really grown to a measure that I'm starting to grasp a little bit what Jesus was after with his disciples. When he does what he did this year, we have now given, through local churches, over 3,000 semi-loads and 150 million meals have been distributed, and that was by the beginning of November. USDA said, all that milk that's being dumped out in the fields, we noticed that you've gone to all 40 states in the last 3 months, and we want to approve your proposal to be a partner with the USDA. And they said, how are you distributing all of that product? And they said, it's simple. We work only through local churches so that we can advance Jesus' gospel, the gospel of the kingdom. And if you have a problem with that, we can't partner. They said, no problem. How many know that Jesus is still who Jesus is? When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things about the kingdom. And when it grew late, Jesus' disciples came to him and said, this is a remote and desolate place, and the hour is late. It's one thing when there's very little on the shelves. It's another thing when there ain't no shelves. You know what I'm saying? In this situation, there was no possibility for going out and buying. But he answered them in 6 words. Do you guys remember them? You give them something to eat. When you have real authority, you don't have to go on and on and on about why it's a good idea, it's a good strategy, people relations, it's very important. You give them something to eat. They reply, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth? That's 200 days' wages worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he said to them 6 more words. How many loaves do you have? You know, earlier in Matthew's accounting, this moment he drilled down a little deeper. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And then Jesus said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest, to send out laborers into his harvest. Randy, which side of the room do the disciples sit on? Oh, they're on both sides, okay. Because he said, Jesus turned and said to his disciples. It's worth noting that in the New Testament, I've counted, any other Bible nerds here, the word Christian is used how many times? 3. And it's a term to designate that outsiders use, not the followers of Jesus. These are the outsiders labeling the followers of Jesus Christian to differentiate that group by the rural rabbi that's leading them, claiming that he's the Christ. Did you know that in the New Testament, the term that Jesus uses for us is disciple? And just by sheer contrast, you know how many times that word is used? It's north of 264. How many of you remember, maybe grew up in church and heard an altar call? Anyone? Like, yeah, okay. What if back in the 50s or the 40s or the 30s, we gave altar calls to become disciples? You know, maybe the church would be known a bit more for its kindness now if we understood what that root means. The word means learner. I mean, know if you're going to follow Jesus, there's kind of a steep learning curve. And so we need to be focused on learning. Might be a good trend. Am I meddling a little bit? Yeah, that's my job. My job. So I'm on the job, Randy. Okay. The term learner describes where we are because the need is seen differently by the master than those who were his learners. Jesus said in this perplexing moment where there isn't a remote possibility because they're in a remote place of feeding someone, that this is a harvest opportunity. I grew up around agriculture, so harvest speaks to me of, wow, we made it this far. There wasn't any hail, there wasn't any drought, there wasn't any flood. We got something to bring in from the field. It's a celebratory time. But he said, what we need is for my people who are following and learning from me to move from the master's class to the labor force. What we need here is workers. But here's a clue. He said, therefore, pray earnestly. To see what I see, you're going to need to have a revolution in your heart, your mind, your thinking. Your eyes need to be refocused on this possibility. You're being asked to share a day's wage. Out of the 240 days that we go to work a year, roughly, to go to work one day for the poor. I want you to know that that one day's work becomes like a 12-inch blanket of snow in a wildfire region for people who need help and hope right now. And when you give it through a local church, and it opens up an opportunity to say, can I pray for you right now? Wonderful things can happen. You see, last year was a record-breaking year with Convoy Hope. To understand what I'm saying is, in 2018, Convoy was able to help churches mobilize 57,000 volunteers across the United States. Isn't that wonderful? In 2019, it was over 90,000. And to think this year, in a pandemic, when we've had more disasters to respond to than we've had in previous years, that we've been able to mobilize all these folks into the workforce of Jesus is an astonishing bit of good news. Last year, in all the year, we responded to 24 major international disasters all year. This year, before November, we had already responded to 30. And they've been huge, guys. Those are just the international ones. When you add in, Laura, and down in Louisiana, and the wildfires on the West Coast. How many know that resourcing local churches to be good neighbors, for some people, it's the worst day of their life, is an opportunity to share the love of Christ. It truly is painful, and harassed and helpless sums it up pretty well. But the door of pain is a door that Jesus is comfortable walking through because he is a man acquainted with sorrow. I think of Bill and Levada Davis in the video. That night when a police officer asked, is there anyone who can take the children home? And waiting for a hand to go up. How important was it that somebody entered the labor force and saw this is a need that we can help? They didn't have a huge bank account. For crying out loud, they only had a single wide trailer. Do you know they had 4 kids of their own? But they had big hearts. And they coached their kids into the workforce saying, we're going to take turns sleeping on the floor so the Donaldsons are understanding that they're home and they're with family. Bill Davis, a couple years ago, said, I never knew that our love for your family, Hal, could result in helping so many millions of people. Go and see what you have. You feed them. How many loaves do you have? Go and see. As it turns out, one of the first answers to Jesus' prayer for laborers coming into the harvest is a little boy with a lunch. Isn't that wonderful? How many times as learners do we have to take off our adult hat and say, you know what? I need to be humble enough to learn from a kid. Do you know that this year, in the United States of America, little kids from all over the country took up the call, saved nickels and dimes, enough to provide more tractor trailers for Convoy of Hope to meet the need of distributing 150 million. How many of you know that a tractor trailer semi with a 40-foot trailer isn't cheap? Do you know what those nickels and dimes from kids, elementary school and junior high, high school, you know what they raised? Kids. They went and saw what they had. I don't know if they looked in the couch between the cushions, Randy, or what. 6 brand new tractor trailers provided by students this year and given to Convoy of Hope. What do you have? You see, we don't understand what Jesus was trying to help Philip understand In one of the accounts of this story, he said, hey, Philip, maybe Jesus having a little fun. Where are we to buy bread so that this many people may eat? And the Word of God says he did this. Remember, we're learners. He did this to test Philip. Good teachers, set up a little situations where they test. Am I right? Jesus is teaching his students towards a really big test, by the way. If you want to read about it, it's in Matthew 25, where it says the end of the age will all be gathered. And there'll be two groups. And one group will be the group that clothed the naked, that fed the hungry, that visited those in prison, and gave a cup of cold water to someone who was thirsty. That's the test he's teaching towards. So he's beginning now, and he's saying, well, hey, it says that Jesus had already decided what he was about to do. He already knew. Do you know with your day's wage, he already knows what he's about to do? We had a friend, my wife's buddy, who's retired here in Fort Collins. And she heard about this and she said, Lord, would you speak to me about the day that I'm supposed to give a day's wage? And she had a number come into her head, like the 17th or the 22nd, or I don't remember the number. But the problem I remember was that it was in the middle of the week, and she's retired, and she was thinking garage sale, right? I'm in a remote place. I'm not in the workforce. Where am I going to make money? What comes to our head? I don't know. How many of you know that you go to try to do the work, right? Because you're diligent. But see, Jesus said the first work we do is to pray. Earnestly pray. Pray like a little boy on the other side of the door listening to his mom cry herself to sleep. God, you got to do something good from this. Help my mom. That's earnest praying. That's the prayer that the Father listened to in the life of Hal Donaldson. Over 130 million people have had the gospel demonstrated because of that 12-year-old boy's prayer. So it's no surprise if you think about it that he spoke to my wife's friend, we'll call her Mary, and said, go to work the 17th. On the 16th, Poudre Valley Hospital called. That's where she had been employed. And she said, the guy on the other end of the phone was a friend. He said, listen, Mary, we're shorthanded tomorrow. And this is what he said. Would you be willing to come in and work for one day? And we'll pay you time and a half. The day. See, Jesus really has decided what he's going to do. You hear that? He is serious about investing in your learning. You're not alone. You're in collaboration with the one. Later, people started following because of what happened. This little boy started a movement, he and Jesus. And they got chased wherever they went, like they were looking for more bread. And to the point where Jesus had to say, don't work for the bread that spoils. That's covered. Relax. I am. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. That's what we're doing. We're partnering so that people can discover the true bread. I love that that Jesus listens when a little boy says, well, I've got a lunch. Doesn't that seem like an absurd thing to offer? What is it about us that we can't learn from kids and we can't learn from the poor? That's why we earnestly pray that we can see the situation for what it is. You see, Jesus is not asking you for what you don't have. I'm not asking you for 200 days' wages, Jesus said to these guys. What do you have? How many loaves? Go and see. I guess I'll give him my lunch, a little guy says. You know, there's nothing wrong with keeping your lunch. That's an ordinary human, practical response. A laborer needs to eat, right? And if you want to just stay in an ordinary zone, there's nothing wrong with that, right, Randy? But if you want to live an extraordinary life, take a day and say, Jesus, here's my lunch. And see how extraordinary your life can be. Pray this. What day, Lord? If you're in a small group, maybe you pick the same day and then you share stories. I don't know. But it'd be wonderful, wouldn't it? To have a moment like this little boy got. He's not asking for what we don't have. But he will often ask us for what we'd like to keep. Do you hear the difference? And when we begin to enter in to trusting Jesus and the exchange that makes, we find out that he listens to the prayers and the tears of a little boy. I want to thank you for the chance to come and share today. But we're not done. I have another video. Aren't you relieved? And it's the story of another little boy whose life could have been defined by tragedy. But I love what Bill Davis told Hal at one point while he was staying there in that single wide trailer. Don't let the tragedy of your youth, Hal, become a lifelong excuse to become bitter. Because where you start out in life does not have to determine where you end up. That's the kind of laborers we need to multiply, right? And in this video, you'll hear the story of a teacher who saw the desperation in a student and began to offering tea and toast every morning and investing in the life of Chege. God bless you guys.
If there's one thing I know, it's that our path in life is uncertain. I'm proof of that. My dad was abusive, violent, and an alcoholic. So one night my dad came home very late, drunk as usual, and he started spitting at my mama. The next morning my dad was gone, but my mom was left agonizing in pain. And she calls me and tells me, Johnson, I want you to run and find your daddy because I feel like I'm going to die. Those are the words I haven't forgotten for the last 17 years. So I ran so fast, found my dad. And when we got back, she was dead. At that time I was 8 years old, but had never gone to school. My father had not let go of the alcoholism. So my grandma brought me to Nairobi. So soon after I arrived, my grandma was able to enroll me at a school called MCDC. Being in school also meant getting help from the Convoy of Hope, who supplied food and other things I needed but couldn't afford. The first shoes I wore was given to me by Convoy. That's the first shoe I wore in my life. Whoever invented shoes is a genius. For 3 years, my teachers didn't promote me to the next class because I was a fool. Well, I think I was a fool because I didn't understand anything in class. And I wasn't disturbed by that. I was only concerned with how I was going to survive. But one day I looked at myself and realized that I was at the bottom of my class and I was tired of struggling in life. I started working hard towards my books and my position in class was increasing. My teachers realized this boy is bright. So they promoted me 1 grade, 2 grades, 3 grades. In 1 year, I caught up in school. I passed my exams and started high school. I shared a room with a dozen other boys at the church, so we didn't have to live at home. Convoy continued to give us food, and we would sit here eating side by side, studying, planning for our futures. At that time, I had a teacher, Mrs. Lewis, who became a guardian angel to me.
You're very bright, Chege.
She knew I was experiencing hardship at home, and she would bring me bread and a cup of tea every morning. This is a woman who changed my perception of life. That's when I knew I wanted to become a teacher. Mrs. Lewis told me I was smart enough to go to university, and I believed her. So I applied to university. I knew I could never afford it, but that didn't matter. I finally had a vision for my future. I wanted to influence young people and educate fools like I had been. So I applied myself even more and I graduated high school near the top of my class. I know my mother would have been so proud of me. Through it all, the death of my mom, struggling in school, graduating, losing my home, selling in the streets, and everything in between, my life was full of chaos and uncertainty. But one day I got the news that changed my life. Because my grades were so good, I was given a scholarship to university. I was so happy, I was beyond words. So now I'm studying industrial chemistry. Someday I'll be a teacher. I'll change the lives of people in situations like mine. So every day I come back here to my school and I tutor kids. I'm telling them that they are valuable. I'm telling them I was like them, hungry in my body and in my mind. And people like Convoy of Hope came along and fed me. And now because of them, I will never be the same. I will accomplish my vision, and nothing can stop me.